Oh, sorry. Hi everyone. Today we will present a case on one of the most controversial issues in the media industry, whether New York Times should continue publish WikiLeaks. My name is Eric. I'm a senior marketing major and management major.
And I'm Sunny. I'm also a senior, double major in finance and management.
I'm Tarek, and I'm a senior in marketing.
Okay, so here's the agenda for today. First, we will talk about what WikiLeaks does, and also what kind of impact they have in the US. And then we will talk about the New York Times interaction with the WikiLeaks. And then also we will start to discover the issues that arises. We will talk about first in the general terms, and then we'll talk about the legal, financial, and ethical aspect of it. And then we have our recommendation solution. So for the background information, WikiLeaks is a whistleblowing organization, and it was formed in 2006 by Julian Assange. His primary interest was to expose the oppressive regime in Asia and in South Africa and Middle East. And then one of the impact that it does to the US is that you actually publish the war logs, for which details about the wars that's happening in Iraq and also Afghanistan. And it also has released over 250,000 cables that they received from the State Department, as well as released another 130,000 of cables by the end of the last month. And in addition, it also has talked to the Bank of America, claimed that they have received a 5 gigabytes of the Bank of America's executives' hard drive, which have the confidential information about their clients and as well as some of their procedures. So before we go even further to the problem with it, we're going to talk a little bit about the New York Times relationship with WikiLeaks. First of all, New York Times first started publishing WikiLeaks article in 2006 in November. And then for the past 2 years, it has increased more publication about WikiLeaks. And then it's different from the other media in the US, because unlike New York Times, Fox News and CNN, they do not publish WikiLeaks. Instead, they cover it. So, but because of that, WikiLeaks, New York Times has been getting a lot of opposition from the public, because some people, there's a lot of controversial issue about whether what they're doing is actually right or wrong. So in response to that, Bill Keller, the executive editor of New York Times, says that we're treating them as a source, not a partner. But then the fact is, the publishers are going on. And the question that we're trying to explore today is, who is really benefiting from the leak, from the publishing? Is it the New York Times itself? Is it for shareholders? Or is it just for the WikiLeaks? So now we can lead into the problems. So some of the potential problems is that there might be a breach of national security when Julian Assange released the information to the editors in Guardian, and there was back then there was also a New York Times editors over there too. And what they say was, what Julian said was that he was expecting the cables, diplomatic cables, came, put the U.S. government in shame, and also as a result, he would expect that Hillary Clinton will resign. And there also might be some political tensions between U.S. and other diplomatic countries. Because what happens is that Julian Assange says that if U.S. government ever arrests him, he's going to just dump all the leaks on the websites. And last but not least, it's a financial threat to the entire U.S. economy. When Bank of America was threatened by WikiLeaks, what happens right away was that the Bank of America's stock price fell for 3%, which is over billions of dollars. So that's only a threat. It's not the actual release of the leaks. So imagine what happens if WikiLeaks actually released the information, and then Bank of America, as one of the largest financial institutes in the world, if it gets impacted significantly, and it's gonna impact the whole entire U.S. economy. So first, let's look at the legal dimension of the problem. Under the protection of the First Amendment, media has the privilege of expressing their ideas, publish the news according to the world, and with a really limited regulation. So for New York Times, they're really familiar with the case dealing with how to publish the governmental issues. Because back in the 1970s, in the Pentagon paper case, New York Times was sued once by the government for exposing their military operation in Vietnam. However, because of the First Amendment, not only New York Times was relieved from lawsuit, and as well as the leak of the information, he was fined. And then the second protection of the law for the media is the Free Flow of Information Act. And this allows of protection for the media who can protect the resources that they are getting for any classified government documents. So, because what happens also in the past was that a lot of journalists, they were persecuted for not willing to release the information. So with those two laws, journalism, they're generally protected by the laws, except the following conditions, the little conditions. And then since the public interest is not in disclosing the information, the source information, so we were expecting that New York Times won't be getting any lawsuit. And they have also been compliant with the law, where they don't really release the name and the sources, and they also consult with the government about what to release and what not to release. So for us, our perspective is that laws and regulation by itself cannot really offer a solution to the case, because right now whatever they do, they really comply with the law. But then, at the same time, there's also no limit to the solution to the problem. And then I think one thing that business is looking for today is not just to comply with the laws, but we also want to look at a different perspectives, such as the business perspective and as well as the ethical perspective. And next, Sunny is going to talk about the business implication of the case.
Now, when we look at the financial aspect of New York Times, as you can see that for the past 4 years, in 2007, their total revenue went from about $3,200,000 till last year, it only left with about $2,400,000, which is their total revenue decreases about $800,000. As you can see that right after 2007 is very significant because 2007 is when they started to publish the WikiLeaks documents onto the New York Times news. Their study shows that their total revenues drop and it helped their revenues to increase. Not only that, it dropped significantly. And if we look at their stock prices performance, it went from about $20 per share to about $6 per share. It dropped about 4 times. It is really important for a business not only to do a good performance, it also is really important for them to keep their shareholder happy, because if they're not doing well in their company, they should think about whether or not they should continue to release the WikiLeaks documents, since they need to spend time to do the editing works, spend time to reviewing all these documents, although it didn't help their company to increase their revenues. And we also found the polls from the Fox News. It clearly indicates that there are about 40% of the public that they views that what WikiLeaks did is wrong, and there also about 61% of the people who thinks that New York Times have no rights to publish articles based on the leaked documents. These are very important polls because it shows one of the reasons why their revenues and their stock price have been decreasing. It might be because the public still views that what they did is wrong, and then they refuse to either purchase their news or to read their news. And I want to talk more about the Bank of America leaked documents. This is very significant because, from a financial perspective, if they it shows on the news that they're going to release this 5 gigabytes of data early next year. If they release it, it has a big financial effect, because, as Eric said earlier, when Julian Assange just announced that he wanted to release the documents, the stock prices dropped 3% already. And it is also clearly shown, it was also stated in the interview between Assange and New York Times stating that the Assange is trying to take down one of the biggest financial institutions in America. So if the stock price only falls 3% a day, we would wanted to know what would happen in the future. And if New York Times keep continuing to help WikiLeaks to publish all these leaked documents, it might have potential, like a lot of damage to the financial industry.
Which leads us to the ethical dimension of this dilemma, if you will. As we can see here, we're going to be talking about WikiLeaks' objectives. Generally, their view is that they want complete transparency, no hidden agendas whatsoever, whether it was an organization or a person. So basically, by saying that, they're saying they don't want any secret agreements or conversation between politicians. And as we can refer back to the incident that happened in Tunisia, where people overthrew their government, and it was mostly done by WikiLeaks, by Tunisian people reading WikiLeaks about their governments. So what I want to say is, too much power could lead to abuse of that power, if you will. If you increase the power of WikiLeaks by supporting it and publishing it, you, on the other hand, are increasing the paranoia of politicians and the public. People are not going to be freely expressing themselves because they think that they might be held liable for what they say in the future, whether through the people they were saying this thing to, or through outside sources that gets their hand on these leaks, if you will. As you can see here, the main principles are defense of freedom of speech for WikiLeaks and media publishing. What they call media publishing, I call unveiling of secrets. Because in politics, especially in foreign politics, if you don't have secrets between two governments to reach a goal, then you probably will not reach that goal. Whether it was to improve the economy or to go against a terrorist or whatever it was, they have to deal in some secrecy in order to keep the goal going. The second point I want to talk about is the ethical standards. WikiLeaks looks at the world with a deontological point of view, which is mostly represented by Kant, if you will. So it's basically the initial action and the motive behind the action is what's important, not as important as the consequences or the result of these actions. So Kant believes that the motives behind the actions are what's considered important versus, for example, governments generally. Governments would work under a teleological view where they would want to maximize happiness and minimize pain for their own people, or for the largest number possible. If you have these two concepts in mind, if you look at this example of torture, for example, let's say there is a building that has a bomb in it, and there is X person who knows about this bomb. From a deontological point of view, you are not to torture that person, because torture is wrong, just from the beginning. But from a teleological point of view, to maximize the happiness of the people here and the building and the economy, they would overlook the point of torturing that person, because it would maximize happiness to the rest. Clearly you can see that both sides look at the action in two separate ways, and there are bound to be clashes between these views. I want to talk about the New York Times and WikiLeaks. The New York Times did not collaborate. That's what they said. Bill Keller actually said this. We did not collaborate with WikiLeaks. However, we looked at it as any other media source, and we researched and we came out with our own interpretation of the case. And also the New York Times went to the Pentagon before they actually released these documents, and they received some feedbacks, but no requests from the Pentagon to cut down on some parts or some cases, because if the Pentagon did that, they would go against the First Amendment that my friend here mentioned earlier. In my opinion, when the New York Times played a role as a mediator between WikiLeaks and the US government, since Assange, before actually coming out with these publications, tried to contact the US government, White House in particular, but he did not get any response. So in some sense, the New York Times played a role of a mediator between WikiLeaks and the US government. Unfortunately, in my point of view, they actually were swayed towards WikiLeaks. Because what happened after releasing the cables that my peers have mentioned here, they have embarrassed the US and caused tension in national security. If they release, which they are saying that they're going to release the documents of Bank of America in February of next year, if they were to release these documents and the New York Times would publish these documents, I don't think the economy of the US have fully recovered from the financial crisis that it's in, and having to impact one of the biggest banks in the financial industry in the States would have the financial economy crumble even further down, in my opinion. I would like to read a quote for you from Senator John McCain about what the New York Times did. John McCain said, I wish the New York Times had chosen not to. McCain says in an interview, it's harmful to the United States of America and our national security interests. Their argument is that it was going to be coming out anyway. But there is a certain imperator of New York Times that gives a certain degree of respectability. So what he's trying to say is that the New York Times has its status in the US and in the world as a news media source. If they have a bigger and higher ethical and moral obligations to its society to not get itself involved in such a controversial situation. I think if they were to publish the Bank of America, it would definitely harm the economy. I guess we're going to have to wait and see on that point. This leads me to the New York Times' primary obligations. In my opinion, they have three obligations. One is to their society and economy in general. Two, to its shareholders, because they have to make their money. Three is their obligations to the audience and their readers. In publishing what the New York Times published since 2007, I believe they covered two of these obligations. Now, whether the results of these covering were to be positive or negative, this is not what I'm discussing here, that was the section of my colleague. But what I'm saying is they covered these two obligations, where they have the interest of their shareholders in publishing and covering these articles, and they have the obligation to their readers who were looking to read such a thing. they covered those two. But what about their obligation to their society and their economy and the United States national security? I think they have failed to cover that one. And in the cables incident, they actually, before they WikiLeaks published their cables incident, New York Times came out with an article about Assange and saying that he's living on a run and he's not a good person in conclusion. But they did not receive the cables through WikiLeaks. They actually had to go out and get it from The Guardian, which is their British ally, if you will, in this case. So they went out and they sought these cables. And why would they do such a thing? Is it to embarrass the U.S. or is it if they want to further discredit the U.S.? There are other ways to do it, but if there's a group out there that is out to discredit the U.S., why would they join this group if they have an obligation to their society? And by that, I conclude my ethics section. From here, I'm going to take you to talk about the solution that we're suggesting to Bill Keller with you. Our solution is the New York Times should not publish these cables or publications in general. They should not support WikiLeaks. However, they have the obligations to their readers and their shareholders to cover the story, like any other media source in the U.S. Fox, CNN, every one of them actually were contacted by WikiLeaks, not only New York Times in the beginning before publishing everything. And they all refused to get involved in such controversial situation. However, the New York Times accepted their terms and they published and covered. So I think they should not publish. They should cover the story because they have the obligations that we mentioned. In the upcoming leaks to Bank of America, if the New York Times were to decide to publish that, I think the economy would be harmed very much, as I mentioned before in my point, and as Sonia mentioned in her point as well. With this solution, we think that New York Times will fulfill all three obligations mentioned earlier to all three parties, and I think it would be a responsible corporate citizen in the society here. So to conclude, today we talked about the controversial situation with the New York Times and WikiLeaks, and if they should publish or not. We looked at the situation, we gave you a small historical brief of WikiLeaks and the New York Times. After that, we talked about the legal implication of the situation, the business and the ethical view of it. Other than that, we thank you for giving us the opportunity to join this competition on behalf of Albert School of Business and Seattle University.